Yeah, I think we have enough people starting at the moment, so let me begin. Hello, everybody. I hope people in the Northeast are staying warm, as we're all trying to do. And welcome to another Bard Center for the Study of Hate webinar. And I'm really excited for today. This is, as you know, is around the new book that we published a couple of months ago called Simply Human, A Guide to Understanding and Combating Hate. And we have three wonderful participants in that project to discuss the book with you and their parts in it. I want to give a little bit of the backstory first before I turn it over to them. So, years ago, over 2 decades ago, the Gonzaga Center for the Study of Hate organized a conference on basically setting up the field of hate studies. And one of the things that it tried to do was to examine the different academic fields, because most academic fields, actually, if you think about it, have something important to say about hate. So it was looking at what does social psychology say, what does history say, religion, law, political science, and other fields, and just what can they contribute and how can we make it so that sociologists and anthropologists that are working on something similar can talk across disciplines and improve what they're doing. So that was great, but one of the things that was missing that I've always wanted to see accomplished was to have another conversation that was more than just cross disciplines in the academy. It was taking the knowledge from the academy and the interdisciplinary study of hate and actually applying it in the real world. And most specifically, I thought, gee, the NGOs that are working on issues of hate could really use this type of guidance. I worked at the American Jewish Committee for 25 years, and one of the things that I remembered very well was helping set up a conference in the early 1990s, right before the Holocaust Museum was going to open up, to how do we deal with Holocaust denial? How do we think about it? And bringing in scholars and bringing people in Holocaust centers and people that were going to open the museum, and came up with a really good understanding of what the Holocaust denial was, how it functioned, what you can do about it, and what these institutions should do and not do. And so the thought was, gee, can we replicate something like that? Bring together academics and people that are maybe the number two or three people at a lot of different NGOs that deal with hate, and have them come together for, again, like 3 days. And I actually planned out who was going to come, what the program was going to be, and got funding from GS Humane Corp, which has been a tremendous supporter of our work. And then the pandemic hit. And so nobody was going anyplace. And obviously, most people are less likely to travel for that type of time. So they were very gracious in saying, let's, turn this into another project with a book, which is actually great because then everybody gets to take the knowledge from this rather than just the participants in the room. So the book has a whole bunch of chapters. You couldn't bring everybody today because it would just take too long, but I just want to outline for people what the book covers. Not every field, but basically, and what I asked the people that were writing the chapters, if you were running an NGO, knowing what you know, what would you do, what wouldn't you do, and why? Why? So Thomas, who you hear from soon, is a philosopher, and with his colleague Brigitte, wrote the opening chapter. And then we had Adriana Galvin, who's from UCLA, who wrote about brain science. There's no like center in the brain that looks at hate, but there are a bunch of things we know about how do we see us and how do we see them, that we're animals, how our brains function, that lays that out, which I think is an important consideration that when we're fighting hate to think about how we're human beings. Then there's social psychology from Gal Lee, who's also a Bard alum. Adam Levin wrote a thing on multi-directional memory, which I think is really very important for groups in this space, because we all think of memories, like Holocaust memory or other memories, as sort of static. They're not. They define what the political needs at the moment are. They negotiate with other groups' memories, and he lays that out in a way that I think is very telling, and also was one of the things that transformed during the process of the writing of the book, because he was writing about the cooperation between the black community in South Africa and the Jewish community on hate crimes issues. And then Gaza happened, and that had its own challenges in memories and which memories you pick. Sarah Lowe and Charlene Joy Jimenez took their experiences from a group called Define American and showed a strategy that works about how do you humanize people through stories and through television and so forth. Lee Badgett wrote a wonderful piece on thinking about not just the moral costs and the political costs of hate, but how do we quantify the economic costs of hate. Jennifer Schwepp and Mark Walters are two of the leading experts on hate crime from Europe. Globally, they're experts, but they're both from Europe and wrote a wonderful piece about hate crimes and how NGOs should focus on them. And one of the things that I thought was really instructive from them was they're not just writing for the academy. They want to really intersect with the police and to have that sort of knowledge go back and forth, and they show how. Joe Usinski wrote a wonderful piece on conspiracy theories, which, we see that a lot these days around hate. Kathy Berger from the Dangerous Speech Project, an anthropologist, wrote about counter speech. One of the things that I hold as a true principle is that to counter speech, you have to not try to suppress it. You have to find other ways to have the free speech have a cost. How do you do that online? How do you do that in the real world? I think that's a very important lesson for NGOs. And then one from Lila Corwin Berman, who talks about how funding implicates issues of hate in the NGO space. And then finally, Arit, who you will hear from, basically tries to pull this all together in a manageable way, taking all the principles so that NGOs can actually use them. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce a very short bio for Tomas and for Arit and for Joe. They're going to each speak for 6 to 10 minutes. Or I tell them whatever they want to talk about and think is important is fine. And, as long as they don't, as I said to one person, as long as you don't do your Fidel Castro, we're okay. And then we'll have a little bit of discussion and then Q&A. And I encourage people, even while there's people are speaking, if you want to put in the Q&A what questions you have, I will moderate that at the end, and then we'll be done at the top of the hour. So Thomas Broodholm holds a PhD in philosophy and is associate professor at the Department of Cross-Cultural and Regional Studies at the University of Copenhagen. He's specialized in the ethics of responses to wrongdoing and has written on both resentment, forgiveness, and hatred. His research on hate is internationally recognized, and I know Tomas is somewhat modest, but in my view, he's unquestionably the leading philosopher on hate. Joe Levin is the co-founder and emeritus board member of the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama. He successfully argued cases involving sex and race discrimination before the United States Supreme Court, testified before the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate on various constitutional issues, and served as the director of the Justice Department transition for the Carter administration, and he held other offices too. But Joe's a mention has been doing this work for a long time, and I'm delighted that he volunteered to write the foreword for the book and is with us today. And Irit Hurvas is an innovator in strategic learning and global social movements and human rights work. She is dedicated to advancing social justice with expertise in qualitative and participatory methodologies, facilitation, research, and evaluation. She has worked internationally, community, national, and multicultural levels. For nearly a decade, she led the strategic learning, evaluation, and strategic development for the American Jewish World Services, a human rights social movement funder. And before joining American Jewish World Service, she worked in global health for over 15 years. And when we first started talking, Arit was basically noting it's a lot easier to evaluate programs where, the end result is how many shots you're going to put in somebody's arms to stop diseases versus hate. But you really stepped up to the challenge of making an evaluation of the knowledge in this book very manageable. So anyway, let me turn it over to Tomas first, and then we'll go to Joe, and then we'll go to Irit, and then we'll have a discussion.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Thank you for inviting, and thank you for initiating this wonderful project and the important book. I'm glad to be here, and I will just try to be as short as possible to make space for questions. But I'm not very good at keeping time, so you can stop me, Ken. If we come close to the 10 minutes, you just stop me. But yeah, as Ken said, I'm a philosopher by training, and hate is an amazing topic, and it has a long, long history in philosophy. I think the first reflection on hate in Western European philosophy was in Plato, with a discussion of what he called misology, which I think is quite politically interesting also today, because misology is a certain kind of aversion or hatred of reasoning or argumentation, a certain problem, I think, that we face also today. But for this chapter, Bridget and I, my co-author, wanted to keep focus close on NGOs and the fighting of hate today. So there's not much reference to neither Plato, Aristotle, nor Kant and others in the chapter. But I think our perspective is a little unusual, and our focus as well, because when you ask how best to combat hate or how best to fight hate, I think most of us will immediately think about strategies and efficiency and what works, what doesn't work. Should we prohibit? Should we criminalize hate speech? Should we not? In Denmark, we have a hate speech law. Is that better or worse than in the US? And so on. But our perspective in the chapter is different, because we take on more philosophical or ethical glasses, and we look at the ethics of combating hate. So the kind of moral questions that emerge as we try fight hate. And maybe briefly, I should say that when I speak of ethics, I'm not just focusing on action or on what is right or wrong to do, but also on character. So what is it good or bad to be? How can we maintain ourselves in the face of hate, you can say? And finally, also ethics as a matter of understanding what matters to us, and also what matters negatively. So for example, what do we mean by hate? So in the chapter, we have all these three dimensions of ethics: action, character, understanding. And then, as I said to Ken when he approached me originally, what do I know about NGOs? And then thankfully Ken helped us set up a series of online meetings where Joe also participated, and several others from different Canadian and US-based NGOs. And Bridget and I and Ken, we asked people simply, so what matters to you? If we say ethics of combating hate, what pops up? What would you never do? What would you do? What is important to you? And the chapter is then based on the responses from the NGOs themselves. So in that sense, we hope to make something that philosophers not often do, which is listening first and listening closely, and then responding closely to what you hear from the field. And so I would just briefly map the three fields of concern. And the first then was about understanding and defining what are we actually fighting when we're fighting hate. So one of our interlocutors said, well, what is important is to clearly define hate. You have to define what you are fighting. And that's in a way something we often skip. I mean, we often, all of us who are engaged in the fighting of hate, we know what it is when we see it, or we know it's about anti-Semitism, homophobia, misogyny, whatever, things like that, group-based prejudice. But still, there's a lot to actually think about. And in the chapter, we try simply to look at how different NGOs provide examples of what they're fighting. And we use those examples to kind of explicate or articulate what is the implicit understanding of this thing we call hate. So this is our agenda. And a different agenda could have been to take a kind of what is hate in the big philosophical sense, kind of a what does it mean to hate? And that would have led us many other ways. That would, for example, you can say hate is also about the brother hating the brother, or it can be about moral character. It can be about many different things. But we, in the chapter, focus on what hate normally or standardly means in NGO practice. And in relation to that, I think there's just one issue that we might discuss later, but that is important, and that is to beware of overgeneralization. I think overgeneralization is a kind of aspect of hating itself, and overgeneralization regarding our understanding of hate would be to presume that what we understand as hate in the fighting of hate covers all hate. And if we talk about, and if we overgeneralize in that sense, then we make different things equal. I mean, there's a difference between the racist, group-based hate enacted in hate crime on the one hand, and then the hatred of which Primo Levi speaks in his Memories of Auschwitz. The survivors' hate, the genocide survivors' hate, and the racist hate, we call it all hate, but there are many different things. So that was the first point about understanding and defining hate. The next kind of discussion we had in the meetings was about what to do and not to do. And that was really interesting, and we had lively discussions. And I'm also kind of mapping out these 3 different fields here, because I think all NGOs should try to enact the same kind of discussions. So what would you never do? People then said things like never lie to the media, never exaggerate, never break the law, never engage in violence, never give oxygen to hate groups, never just do what feels good immediately, but what is good and what will bring good about. And these things are, of course, easy to say. And in actual practice, if you engage in demonstrations and you face confrontation and violence, things can become more murky and difficult to deal with. But I think this is a really important discussion for all NGOs to engage with. What will we never do? What should we do? And this is also where one could think about whether there should be some kind of code of conduct or a Hippocratic oath for NGOs, or some discussion across NGOs about what is the most important thing to us. What are the values that we are committed to as we publicly articulate opinions and actions about hate. And in my world, the world of academics, we do have such codes of conduct. And at my university in Denmark, the University of Copenhagen, we have this code of conduct for when we speak, as I do now, in the public. And we are committed to not just free speech, but more specifically also honesty, transparency, and accountability. And I cannot just claim free speech if I'm, after this meeting, approached by my department leader because I was lying all the time and I was really non-transparent, then I have made a fault. And maybe this kind of a code of conduct could also be applied to NGOs. The third field was then about character or motivation. And in ethics, it's what is called virtue ethics, or ethics concerned not so much with what is right to do or not do, but about who we are and what we become through life. And in that context, one could first, actually, we don't do that in the chapter, but what one could think about, what are kind of the moral character development possible through engagement long-term in anti-hate work. It could also be a positive thing. So it could be like you build up integrity, courage, deliberate resentment, toleration, free speech, ability. So thinking about virtue and vice and moral character in this context could also have a more positive focus than the one that I'm now focusing on, because what we rather focus on in the chapter are kind of the possibly negative outcomes of long-term participation. And as you know, in other fields, for example, in the psychological assistance to veterans, combat veterans, there's a lot of talk of moral injury, whether you, apart from the physical injuries, can have a kind of moral injury from participation in combat. And also in healthcare, there's a talk of moral distress and moral stress. And we just wonder, could is a similar kind of focus also relevant in the context of long-term engagement against hate? Can you be morally injured or morally stressed through the battle? And we went in the discussion, one of our interlocutors said, never or don't let the hate consume who you are. Don't let the hate consume who you are. And I think that's a wonderful sentence, and it brings to mind a lot of different stories and histories, and you can interpret it differently, of course. And one thing could be like, be careful, both you personally and in the organization, not to obsess in the fight of hate. Of course, it's so important to fight hate, and it's such a laudable struggle that you could immerse into it in a way where you kind of fail to take care of yourself or your children or your family. So could be a danger of a moral obsession, even as important as the struggle is. Another interpretation of don't let the hate consume who you are could be more about moral corruption. This is the worst option, that you in the fight of hate become hateful yourself. And as a philosopher, one cannot help thinking of Friedrich Nietzsche and his old warning that when you fight monsters, be careful lest you yourself become a monster. And I think this is, I don't know, this is something NGOs should discuss. Is this a realistic thing at all? Could it happen that the one who fights hate becomes hateful? I would just put it out as a possible reading of the claim that we heard. Concerning moral distress, in the chapter we discuss how we should kind of articulate or the goal of the struggle. Because in many places, when you look at the homepages of NGOs, there's a lot of reference to stop hate or never again hate, no more hate, as if the goal is a world without hate. And if you commit to that goal, it might be a recipe for kind of also endless frustration, because you will never fully get rid of it. So, and that could be a cause of moral distress, because you will never succeed. So it's always up and down and up and down. And then in philosophy, there are people saying that maybe we should think about the whole struggle in another sense, not like getting rid of it, but more like being able to maintain a perpetual struggle. And maybe we are more used to thinking about getting rid of the problem. And it reminds me, I'm an engaged sea kayaking person, and in kayaking, there's a difference between the Euro paddle, the European style, and the indigenous Greenlandic style. And the European style is how quickly can you get from A to B? How can we construct the paddle so that you kind of get as quickly as possible through the 100 meters? And that whole idea of overcoming as quickly as possible can lead to a lot of shoulder pain. Whereas the old Greenlandic indigenous way of paddling is more like, how can you go on doing this for your whole life? How can you keep hunting and keep kayaking your whole life? We need another kind of paddle for that engagement. And I think the Greenlandic concept is maybe better than the European for maintaining the struggle against hate. So that were the three kind of aspects that we try simply to open a new discussion, because what we heard from some of the people participating in the discussion was that we don't really talk about this. And in our NGO, there's a culture of toughening it out. You have to deal with it. And what we try to do with the chapter is to put this into words and put it into the open, and to then hopefully, inspire NGOs to set aside time and space to talk about this.
Thank you, Thomas. I really appreciate that overview. And, I'll say I got a chuckle when we had an early conversation, and, it was the philosopher you who had the most practical suggestion about why don't we put together some NGO folks so we know how all this works, right? So, and that was brilliant. And one of the first people we went to was Joe, who's legend, helping co-found the Southern Poverty Law Center, has been working in this space for decades. And I was very delighted that Joe participated in those conversations and then was so gracious about writing the foreword for the book. So, Joe, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Uh, I'll try and keep it brief. I'm not good at that. I was born in 1943. My father was Jewish. He was a native of Newport News, Virginia. In 1882, my great grandparents, Isaac and Annie Lippman, who were 16 and 15 at the time and married, walked from Odessa to Bremen, Germany. And they were escaping the ethnic cleansing that had been instituted by Alexander III. Alexander III succeeded his father, and like many of the Romanovs, had a global vision for Russia. He was committed to making Russia great again through intense nationalistic and isolationist policies. That may sound familiar. My dad had an easier trip. He migrated to college at the University of Alabama and graduated from its law school in 1934, moved to Montgomery, Alabama to practice law with a classmate, and eventually established his own commercial practice. My mother, Ann Hutto, was born in Jasper, Alabama. She was a descendant of generations of farmers. She was the youngest of 14 siblings. She moved to Montgomery, met my father, and they married. My mother was raised Christian but converted to Judaism. On her side, the Ottos, as they were known around 1735, when they immigrated from Germany to South Carolina, likely left Germany because of the persecution of Lutherans. I don't want to shock you, but my great grandfather, John C. Hutto, was a major in the Confederate Army. There's a Sons of Confederate Veterans camp named for him in Walker County, Alabama. So I grew up in the era of Jim Crow. I didn't feel like a racist, but of course I was. Virtually all whites were. I never heard my parents use the N word, but that didn't matter. The separation was graphic. It's all that my family, my friends, and my community had absorbed for their entire lives. I'll say this, just to quote a judge in Montgomery at the time, Judge Walter B. Jones, who was, to say the least, an intense racist. Judge Jones said this. He said, "We have all kindly feelings for the world's other races, but we will maintain at any and all sacrifices the purity of our blood strain and race. We shall never submit to the demands of integrationists. The white race shall remain forever white." I never thought I'd hear that kind of language in the 21st century, but here we are. There was some, but very little anti-Semitism. For the Jewish community, assimilation was the name of the game. The event that triggered my change of mind occurred in my undergraduate years at the University of Alabama around 1962. There's too much detail for right now. It's in the foreword that's written for the book. After graduation from law school and 2 years in the Army, I returned to Montgomery in 1969. Serendipity intervened. I met Morris Dees. We tried some cases together, started a law firm, and in 1971, with the help and encouragement of the late Julian Bond, who served as our first president, we established the Southern Poverty Law Center. So the SPLC has now been operating for almost 55 years. Discrimination on the basis of gender identity, race, religion, formed the basis for much of our decades of litigation and education. Hate, bigotry, and bias were our targets. And although we have exercised many connections with other like-minded groups, as thoroughly discussed in Simply Human, it's not enough. Our efforts to educate children and the general public, in my opinion, have been excellent. But our discussion with others about our approach, its motivation, results, has been lacking. Well, we're not alone. Other prominent groups live too much in a bubble as well. In post-election 2016, an article in Politico, excuse me, quoted Steve Bannon as saying this: "It was always great to hear what the hobbits had to say, because at the end of the day, what they had to say mattered most. This whole movement, it's really the top of the first inning." Now, Bannon, as I think most of you know, is a close associate of our current president. So what inning are we in now? Have we reached a seventh inning stretch? Nope. I think the other team has the bases loaded. Our school systems, public and private, must do a better job of educating our children so that future generations do not fall prey to the same bigotry and hate that we've seen for far too long. Donald Trump's efforts to rewrite history throughout the United States demonstrate exactly why Simply Human must be read by educators, parents, and those whose work involves issues of hate, bias, and bigotry.
Thank you, Joe.
Hope is not enough.
Sorry. Okay, sorry.
Hope is not enough. We must act. To quote the head of the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, a group very active in keeping any particular religion out of the U.S. military, Mikey Weinstein said this: "What we think, know, and believe is of little consequence. All that matters is what we do."
Thank you, Joe. Sorry to step on you before you're finished. I appreciate you doing that.
All right.
Okay. And I reach over to you. So how to talk to people about pulling together all the information from the book and how you suggest that people evaluate this. I also want to open up to people, A, put questions in the Q&A if you want, but B, also in the aftermath of this, email me because we can help you if you want to do an internal review as Reet's going to outline for you. And I will post in the chat a little bit later a link to the checklist that she put together and she will talk about.
Great. Thanks, Ken. And thanks, Tomas and Joe. Tough act to follow. I'm really appreciative to be here today. I should warn you, I'm in Asia, so my time zone is off and my camera is blurred. I'm on old technology. Thank you for your patience. As Ken introduced me, I am a research and evaluation practitioner. I've worked in the field of public health and human rights for over 25 years. Recently working with a funder supporting marginalized communities engaged in social movements, fighting for human rights and seeking justice in Asia, Africa, Mesoamerica, and the Caribbean. Ken invited me to write a chapter on evaluation, recognizing the importance of challenging our assumptions and biases about our own work, knowing we need to act, but also making sure that we're questioning the results that we're seeing or we think we're seeing. Are we achieving what was intended, and are there any unintended consequences? We know addressing hate is difficult, and as the book demonstrates, requires a multiplicity of strategies and tactics, from education to legal approaches, to multimedia, to really understanding the psychology of humans. all of the various chapters that other authors have presented. Evaluation is equally difficult. And in the chapter, I posit that we need to step back as an NGO community and really start thinking about learning and how we want to learn about what we're doing. And the challenges are clear, and I'll speak a little bit about those before I launch into the checklist. So first, the context of addressing hate. And, I reread this list that I produced for the chapter and that we thought quite a bit about in the human rights field. And in today's context is startling. Of course, around the world, people experience this context on a routine basis. But of course, in our country, this is, it's poignant. So results can be tenuous and difficult to ascertain in the short term. We know change is not linear and it's difficult to sustain. Regress is actually very normal and should be anticipated. The ecosystem is dynamic. There are many other actors, factors at play. And, the big challenge for evaluation is that attribution is difficult, if not impossible, because the sum effect is often greater, for better or worse, than one specific action or intervention. Responses are counterintuitive, backlash is normal. Opposing forces, as we see now, are often powerful and very strategic. So in this volatile context, culture is entrenched and can be slow to shift, which makes evaluation very difficult, but possible. So depending on the particulars of a program, the evaluation questions at hand, there are methodologies. But I would argue that more meaningful opportunities emerge if a few basic principles about learning are in place. And learning here is defined as an iterative, responsible, and flexible practice in which there are critical and systematic reflection using evidence, including evaluation, but not limited to evaluation, to understand and challenge our assumptions, biases, progress or regress towards desired and expected change. This will help us inform strategic decisions and respond dynamically to unanticipated development or consequences. So I believe that organizations need to reflect on their values vis-a-vis learning and evaluation and really begin to value learning as transformative. We need to step back and start nurturing a learning culture. We need to make sure we're measuring what matters. And we need to leverage our learning and share it with others, as this book clearly is a starting point to doing. But of course, evidence is not static. Each of the authors point to areas where more research is needed, and we should be attending to that and cultivating active, dynamic dialogue about what's working and what's not. And the checklist supports that initial first step. So for example, what do I mean by valuing learning as transformative? Why are you doing evaluation? For whom are you doing evaluation? With whom are you doing evaluation? These are core questions. There are great examples from other authors in the book where learning is integral to the work. For example, I think of Define America and how actively they're evaluating what they're doing on a routine basis and learning from their work in an iterative and dynamic way. But very often we see learning, monitoring, and evaluation as a reporting requirement. NGOs are funded by donors, and those donors have their own ideas about what we should be measuring and why. And it puts pressure on NGOs to demonstrate success and creates upward accountability as opposed to accountability towards the people being affected. So what would it look like to see the true power of learning and leverage it, focusing on those people who are affected by hate? How is learning truly being valued in your organization? And if it's not, if it is siloed and supporting donor reporting, what are you losing out on? The second section in the chapter focuses on nurturing a learning culture. Cultivating a culture of learning is incredibly important. and a way in which you demonstrate your values, and the structures and spaces that you create to support staff to make their thinking visible and engage in meaningful dialogue about their hypotheses and reflect on evidence, either through evaluation or other experiences. Both progress and regress and questioning your assumptions and biases is important. A strong culture will support strong learning habits. Strong systems and processes will, emphasize and support a stronger culture. A little tautological there. Measure what matters. So given the many accountabilities you have, what is most meaningful to measure? And I'm using the term measurement quite broadly. It does not mean just quantitative measurement. And in fact, we often fall prey to quantitative measurement because it's much easier for donors to aggregate. What do we really need to know, and how can we best understand that in a timely way that isn't burdensome to everybody in the picture, and is, I guess, most importantly, actionable? We need to prioritize. Capturing data can be incredibly costly and drive learning systems and culture in ways that oppose the value of learning as transformative. It requires conceptual clarity and, again, commitment to action. And if you have clear conceptual clarity and you're measuring what matters, this can support experimentation and, perhaps more importantly, the flexibility to refine or change course when you find that you're not actually affecting change. So often I see programs assume that what they're doing is good because you fall prey to such strong belief in what you're doing that you assume you can't be causing harm. And you must be successful because of the passion in which you engage. Finally, how are we sharing out our learnings? How are we engaging others in dialogue? Engaging in dialogue about what we're learning can inform future action, future experimentation, partners, and synergies, and really advance the impact of our collective efforts. This brings us to the checklist. The checklist serves to contribute multidisciplinary learning to the field. It's comprised of a list of key considerations for reflection. These are organized by chapter. They were produced in combination, in collaboration with each of the authors, as well as myself and Ken, who carefully reviewed the chapters and pulled out kind of summative considerations for reflection for your own programs. Of course, as you read the book, you may have your own takeaways and want to add those into the list. What I would suggest as a practitioner that routinely facilitates participatory engagements, I think using this checklist to reflect on your work in a collaborative dialogical space can support and nurture your own learning culture. You might bring your organization together to resonate, to reflect on what resonates with you, what surprises you, what challenges your existing thinking. You might explore how you might experiment within the context of your work and some of the findings that are presented, what you might do differently based on these findings. If you identify many actions that you could take based on the list of key considerations, I would suggest you consider prioritizing them and setting the work into motion with follow-up discussions, bringing in new evidence and insights as you go. So I will stop there and leave time for questions. Over to you, Ken.
Great. Thank you so much, Arvid, for that. And people, I saw a couple of questions. We'll take some more. So feel free to put them in. Just a couple of observations. One is that the checklist and what I put together is really very handy going through, again, all the chapters, but some of the principles. I think one of the takeaways from Tomas's discussion of ethics and the idea of how do we understand what we're doing is that at least from the other chapters in the book and his book, NGOs that are deciding to do something or not do something should at least be able to go through the mental exercise of saying, how do we really think this is going to work? And then from some of the other chapters, like the one from Define American, then the creating what they call the feedback loop. So it's not just you make the decision, you do it, you're doing triage, and moving on to the next thing. It's that you're setting up a culture that really examines what you did, and and the most important part of that I thought was what your failures are, because you have the funders wanting to know that you're successful, you want to be successful, but you have an ethical obligation, I would argue, and I think that chapter makes a compelling case for others to not walk down that same wasteful path. So you should share those experiences, and funders should encourage that. And in terms of the Tomas's observation about hate consuming folks too, I'll just share, one short thing that made me laugh. I told Tomas this when we spoke maybe a year or two ago. I was doing a workshop for Jewish communal executives about hate. And one of them was really very upset with my suggestion that, hatred, or at least our capacity for hatred, is part of we are as human beings, how we see us versus them, and so forth. And really, just thought that was awful. He thought that's not true. And he said, "I don't hate anybody except anti-Semites." So there you go. People always find who they want to hate. Anyway, let me go down to the questions. There's one for Joe. You stressed the important role of our education system in preparing the next generation to combat bigotry, hate, and bias. How do our schools do that? And that's very similar to the first question we got as well.
Well, I can describe to you what the center has done over the years. We originally started out with a teaching tolerance program. Over a number of years, the word tolerance got somehow criticized because it doesn't sound good enough. So we changed it to learning for justice. And what we've done over the years is to distribute films and other educational materials to schools around the country in order to provide information that can help students lots of occasions at a young age to appreciate our history and how the issues that we're addressing having to do with bias and hate have affected us, and trying to be, number one, historical, correctly historical in the way we present it, and making an argument that that is not necessarily so direct in the videos or material, but is suggestive. It's there. This is what you can do to avoid what you may have seen in this film or what you may have read in the material that we sent. I don't know that thoroughly addresses the question, but that's what we've done over time.
Yeah. So another question: how are current efforts? I guess what it means. How do current efforts differ from historical approaches? So I guess the other fields as well. I don't know if Tomas or Joe, you want to answer that. As opposed to just looking at history, what are the approaches that the book resonates for you in terms of how to think about hatred?
Well, I do think that hatred, what do you call it? Hatred, bias, bigotry, the dislike or disapproval of other religions, other races, those whose gender identity may not satisfy the way you think about the world. The way that particularly today in the United States, where we have so much pressure being brought upon schools and teachers not to teach history and to destroy history, This has become an issue that, quite frankly, I never anticipated. So just getting the material out, the voice out today is extremely difficult. People are fearful, and rightly so. We know why. We've seen it. I don't need to go through it. There is injury that can occur if you do not do what our current administration wants you to do and wants you to avoid. I could go on forever, but and I'm not sure I addressed it directly, but that's what we see now. It is critical to get an honest history out to students, especially, but to adults as well who've never experienced it.
Thank you, Joe. You know, I think one of the things that comes across in Adam Levin's chapter is, again, the fact of how history is thought about and how it's used politically and how it manifests sometimes in conflict between communities, which leads us into the next question. Whoever wants to take it. It says, so many people share their pains from being harmed by dehumanizing hate, however, are oblivious or very disconnected from others' experiences. And also sometimes it feels like some people's experiences are drastically different, but to them the impact feels similar. For instance, anti-Asian hate versus the long history of anti-black racism. But sometimes people seem to want to make them equivalent. Is it worth having community conversations to understand one another's experiences? Whoever wants to take that. I mean, Tomas, you've dealt with Tomas. Let me turn to you, because you've dealt with the reconciliation folks in South Africa. You've been looking at this for a long time. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, what I think in relation to that question, my hunch is that yes, yes, indeed, that it is important to try share both experiences with hate and to share different experiences of grief in the face of what is going on in the world across groups. For example, in Denmark, after the at the same time as what had happened and is happening in Gaza, the chief rabbi urged Danes to be open to grief on all sides of what is going on. So I think it is very important, and I think it's exactly correct what Christina writes, that there are certainly things that overlap, but there are also differences, and we shouldn't let the word hate lead us to presume that homophobia and anti-Semitism and misogyny are all the same. I'm not even sure whether they have one thing in common, all of them. I think I've tried hard to think about all the things we call hate and the different kind of groups that can be targeted by it and the different kind of attitudes and perpetrators. And from everyday bias in a stable democracy to ethnic cleansing, to genocide, to denial of history. We often use the word hate to cover all of that. And I think it's like there are many different relations between the different things we call hate. So it makes sense to call all of it hate, but there's not one thing unifying all of them. I try to think, could it be, prejudice? But I'm not sure that all hate needs to be a matter of prejudice. I think you can hate due to all too real experiences with what is going on in the world. And could it be a desire to rid the world of the thing you hate, this desire to annihilate or exterminate, or at least to remove from your field? And for sure, much of what we call hate in relation to hate crime does not kind of express this annihilatory urge. It's more like aversion or antipathy or disgust. So I think if you sit down and really try to find something that unites all of these different kinds of hate, I gave up, at least. So therefore, but they're not entirely different, and there are elements coming across. So I think Christina got it just right, saying that, listen and look and talk, because there's a kind of family, an unpleasant family, but there's a family of aversions and hatreds that can be compared and that we should compare.
Great. Thank you. And we have about 5 minutes left, so I want to just piggyback onto that, and then I'll give you each a couple of minutes to say any closing remarks you want. But one of the things that also I think answers that question well is a story that Adam again tells in his chapter about multi-directional memory that he and I talked about from one of my experiences at AJC, which people may remember years ago there was an exhibit. I forget if it was Ellis Island or was it Statue of Liberty, but there was going to be an exhibit in New York on, quote, America's concentration camps, put together by a Japanese American museum, talking about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And the Jewish community was going apoplectic. You can't use that term. That's our term. You're diminishing the Holocaust. It's awful. Don't do it. Change it. And there had been enough connection between the Jewish and the Japanese American community. The Jewish community was very helpful to the Japanese American community getting reparations for the internment experience and so forth. So there was at least communication open, and people decided, wait a minute, this is getting crazy. Let's sit down and talk. We had leaders come together in a room. And the upshot of it was we were able to put together a decision that, yeah, they can keep the name, but there was going to be an unmissable plaque at the beginning of the exhibit that said, here's the talk about Joe in history. Here's the history of the term concentration camp, going back to the Boer Wars and so forth, and then talking about what had happened during the Holocaust, medical experiments, gas chambers and so forth, and distinguishing that from the Japanese American internment camps, but then concluding exactly what Tomas was talking about, the commonality, saying what they had in common was that there was a group in society that was targeted to be removed and the rest of society let it happen. So it found a way of harmonizing as opposed to making those memories compete. And that's part of what I think are good approaches. And one of the lessons that comes back from the book is how do you build those coalitions? How do you think about things beyond your own experience to try to make your work more effective as an NGO or as a person? Anyway, so we've got a couple of minutes left, so let's do it in reverse order. Why don't we do Arit and then Joe and then Tomas? Just any final words of people takeaways that you'd like them to have from this book or the conversation?
I guess I would highly recommend that you read the book. I think each of the chapters really offers unique insights, but complementary insights, and it's very readable. And then take a look at the key considerations and think about how your work can be improved. Right, that is the whole purpose of this. If you're working in an NGO, do a careful read. And of course, we're happy to support you in that process, should you like.
Thank you. Joe? You have to turn off, you're muted.
I would say not just for NGOs and others who actually engage in this work, but everybody, everybody, because this book will explain issues of hate and bias and the ways that they'll explain it in the context of humanity. And that to me is the biggest thing, because it exists. It's always going to exist. The issue is, as human beings, how do we address it?
Thank you, Joe. And finally, Tomas?
Yes. Okay, as the philosopher, I guess it's my task to kind of try to turn things a bit around. And so I think one of the, now that Joe talks about humanity, I think one of the difficult ethical questions in this whole field relates also what Irit also talked about as the engagement in dialogue. With whom can we talk? And we also discussed that in the meetings. We should talk with one another, those of us, we are reasonable people who are fighting hate. But what about those we say hate? What about the haters? Can we talk with the hater? And should we even try to talk with the hater? There are certainly situations where we should not talk with the hater. But at the same time, I think, at least also in philosophy, when we philosophers write about hate, it's always the other. It's never us. I mean, with many other emotions, we can include examples of memories of our own anger, our own disgust, our own disappointment, shame, and so on. But you don't very often find an article or an essay that includes the direct experience of hating, or that actually engages in conversation with the hater, or let the hater speak, because the hater speaks hate speech, and we don't want to hear that. But I wonder sometimes, and I think that's a moral challenge, about the humanity of the hater, and that it's important not to be too quick. and maybe, I don't know how, and I'm not even sure why, but I think it's a question whether and how and why to remember that the hater is also a human being, and that it might pay to try talk also with the hater. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I mean, two final words from that. One is at again, Kathy's chapter there about how do you counter speech that you find hateful, not necessarily to convert people, but how do you, other people are watching sometimes those conversations, and strategies for that, which I think all NGOs, should think about. And then finally, a point about the hater being human too. I mean, when I talk about some of the tensions on campus over Israel and Palestine, I basically tell students, your job is not to solve the conflict. Your job is to treat your classmates well, to have emotional empathy and intellectual curiosity about why somebody has a view you find hateful, why they have those views. Can you put yourself in their shoes? You don't have to agree with them, but it's a better exercise for you, as opposed to just writing them off. For you to combat hate, it's better for you that you understand what drives them, so you can actually negotiate it better, and that the haters are human too. I mean, I guess the final word is they're simply human. Anyway, thank you all very much. And I appreciate it. And I will send out an email tomorrow with the checklist. And again, as Reed said, and I said before, if there's any way we can help people, either you're concerned about places you're funding and want them to take some of the lessons from this book, or your inside organizations, it's an open door. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you, Joe and Irit and Tomas. Take care. Bye-bye.